Hello, I'm Josephine Burton, and welcome to the Dash Arts podcast, seeing the world through an artistic lens. On March the 11th this year, that is 2020, we held a live Dash cafe at Warwick Arts Centre, thinking and talking about art and activism, or rather, Artivism. We explored the sweet spot between making a work of extraordinary artistic quality and a work that has the potential to change our world. I brought together theatre director Sophie, director of The World We Made, which premiered at Warwick Arts Centre in 2019 as part of the Change Festival. Amahra, Spence and Amber Caldwell, artists and co-directors of Birmingham-based arts group MAIA, and Dr. Michele Aaron, filmmaker, curator and reader in film and television studies at Warwick University, to join us on our quest. So, in today's episode, I'm going to play you this live recording, and I'll be back at the end with some more thoughts. Here we go. I'm going to ask each of you to sort of introduce yourself by way of telling us all about a particular event or a particular work of art which had a profound impact on you and your practice and your work as an artist and a practitioner. Do you want to start, Michele?
I'm probably going to start in a bit of a cynical way, so I won't talk about one specifically. I'm an academic, and I need to point out, by the way, that I'm here not in my capacity as an academic at the University of Warwick, because I'm currently on strike as part of the UCU strike. So I'm here as the festival director and curator for Screening Rights Film Festival, which is a Midlands-wide social justice film festival. So I'll be talking in relation to that principally. So in terms of art, I've always felt very impacted by art. That's probably why I went into studying, researching, and creating audiences around it. But I think the most impactful scenario for me was when it was the launch night of a research project that had seen me produce a number of films with participants from a hospice in North Birmingham. And at that launch night, we screened it. And I think I had, for the first time, a real awareness of, one, that my job could actually be quite valuable in bringing this kind of work to audiences, and that films in particular, because I think films are especially powerful in terms of the possibility of harnessing and creating change, that films can truly kind of have this profound effect on an audience. And I don't just mean emotional or necessarily inspirational, but actually change views. And that was sort of quite a significant moment for me and has influenced a lot of what I've done since then.
Thank you very much, Michele, and we'll hear a little bit later a bit more about your work. And Amber, the same question.
So my background is kind of dance and performing arts, that sort of thing, growing up. And before I started studying in a sort of academic capacity, I saw a piece of work by a French dance company called Frank de Louise. And they did a piece which basically was about breaking free from this kind of robotic and sort of linear lifestyle that they were all in. And I just really enjoyed the whole sort of narrative of the challenges of becoming free. And that really sort of spurred me on to want to create my own pieces of work and create my own stories within sort of dancing. And I was really young then, so it was like a new experience and something to see. And that spurred me on to want to go and study in the arts, sort of, and continue it on. Obviously, fighting with my parents.
Thank you, Amber. And Amahra?
I'm co-director of a company with Amber called MAIA, and over the last few years we've been exploring this relationship between art and urbanism, and one of the more profound, I'd call it movements rather than a specific artwork, is, I don't know if anyone is familiar with Project Row Houses, which is it's an initiative in Houston, Texas, and it was set up by 6 African-American artists who were kind of exploring, are there really pragmatic things that we can do with our creativity? And I'm interested in that, like the poetry of creativity and like poetic pragmatism. What does that look like? They set up this housing initiative that was basically a direct response to some of the social challenges in the Third Ward of Houston. And I'll probably talk about it later, but it's incredible. So give it a Google.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing more about MAIA Group a little bit later. And Sophie.
So I'm probably going to come from a slightly negative place, I guess, in the inspiration for me. So I grew up in a small village in Norfolk, where like the only sort of entertainment was amateur dramatics, and everyone got involved, and it was incredibly playful, and that was the only thing I sort of did because I did terribly at school. And I was 17, had just left school, didn't really know what I was going to do, so I got a secondment at the National Youth Theatre. I was no good as an actor, so I was invited to work in the office, and they had a couple of spare tickets, and it was the summer holidays. The National Theatre had given them some spare tickets to see a show, so I went to see it, and it was Alan Bennett's House and Garden, and it was just full of blue rinses. No offence to blue rinses at all, but there was no one young at all in the audience. This was the summer holidays. This was their show-stopping summer show, and it didn't speak to me in any way whatsoever. It didn't inspire me. It felt rigid. It felt old. It felt boring, and I felt disappointed that the National Theatre wasn't doing anything for people like me, and just didn't represent anything that I believe. Well, it represented something in the country that I didn't sort of feel inspired by, and it spurred me on to become a director that wanted to speak to a wider range of people, a more diverse audience, and encourage a playful and imaginative sense of what the world could be, rather than representing what the world is currently. And so I went on to become a director, probably not off the back of that, obviously, but it was quite a big catalyst for me.
Thank you very much, Sophie. This evening came about because we at Dash were privileged to be part of the Change Festival that happened here in autumn last year, which was the first version of the festival that explored kind of climate change, but also social action and the wider opportunities to change our world. And as part of the evening, Sophie Austin premiered a new work, The World We Made. Sophie, do you want to explain a little bit about the evening and about The World We Made?
Yeah, sure. So it's wonderful to be back at Warwick Arts Centre to talk about this show, because it's a massively important part of my life, I think. So inspired by what I was just saying about when I was 18 and thinking about what theatre I wanted to make, I've gone on to make political theatre, or theatre that really sort of speaks to us now and tries to help us imagine a different future. And Becky Birchall, who produced the Change Festival, came to me and said, what work is out there at the moment? What theatre shows or plays are sort of talking about climate change, but not in a apocalyptic, we're all going to die sort of way, but in one that can inspire hope or change or new thought and new ideas. And I drew a blank. I couldn't think of any writers that were working in that sort of way at that time. And she presented me with Jonathan Porritt's book, The World We Made, and I don't know if any one of you has read it, but it's an incredible sort of a thesis on all the things that have happened, but also the things that could happen to make the world a better place, and to certainly work with climate change better and ensure that we are still alive and around in 2050. And she said, I want to turn this into a play. It's pretty weighty, it's pretty hefty, it's quite a challenge to read at some points. But I was like, yeah, let's try it, let's give it a go. And we brought the writer Beth Flintoff on board to turn it into a play. And she did an amazing project on it. And she created it in a way that enabled us to see all these different characters who have done so much over the last 50 years, but also went on to do so much in the next 50 years. And so we made it come to life. And a big part of the work that I do is immersive, it's site-specific, it's out on the streets, it's where people go. So one of the things when I wanted to stage this play was to think about the staging of it and to make sure that it wasn't a passive piece of theatre where you sat down, shut up, went into the background and disengaged. It was about getting you involved and getting you as immersed in this potential hope and change.
Sophie, can you tell us a little bit about how the kind of reception, how it was received by audiences like ourselves?
It's been a really interesting play to put on, and as I said before, I'm interested in putting plays on in non-theatre venues, I suppose, to reach a sort of wider audience, or if I do put them on in a theatre venue, and it's in a more interactive way, I guess. So we've done them in church halls, in village halls, in business boardrooms, schools, and we've done it here as well. So we've met with a lot of different sorts of audiences, but it's genuinely been a really moving evening. The play is about an hour and 20 minutes, and then we always have a conversation afterwards, because that's as important as the actual play itself, because it's about getting people to talk about what they're worried about, what they're frightened of, what they know, what they don't know, and enabling people to feel like when they leave the audience, the show, that they can do something. And one of the things that we've done is we've been teaming up with Extinction Rebellion and often going to some of their meetings. And what's become really clear is that the exhaustion that people are feeling from fighting, from needing to stand up and be active and be participant and act and have this activism, is that it's hard, and it's a hard thing to sustain. So knowing that the arts community and that there are plays out there trying to spread their message of hope and change, they felt really rewarded by.
And do you said at the beginning that the kind of the impetus for the play was really Becky's, since the suggestion that it'd be fantastic to have something that was about hope and optimism rather than just totally being hit over the head by a sledgehammer. And do you think that's one of the magic ingredients that has the power, kind of embedding hope and optimism in a work that could potentially kind of create change?
For me, 100%. That and comedy, I think. I think there's something really easy about bringing a sense of disaster and doom to everything. It's lazy. I think that's an obvious thing. We're all going to die. Yes, we are. But what's next? You know, what else is there? And I think it's so invigorating to see something that comes with answers or possible solutions or suggestions or just tries something, you know. And that's quite rare, I think.
I'm going to turn to Michele, really, on that note, to bring you into the conversation, Michele, both as an academic researcher and as a curator of the Screening Rights Festival. I wonder, obviously, you introduced your work by talking about hospice care, which must be somewhat bleak and I imagine not enormously optimistic. Do you identify, or do you try to find that in your work? How does what Sophie says, does it touch you? Does it strike a chord for you?
Well, it was so resonant because I think that's the hardest thing. Especially, I'll speak about the film festival first, because its mission is to bring films that wouldn't necessarily come to our neck of the woods, films that I think are really significant in how they're telling stories, true stories. They're documentary and they're feature films from around the world. Some may be critically acclaimed, some may have just missed out on that, but they've got really important stories to tell and are doing it in really fascinating ways that I think need to be seen. But they're often bleak. You know, they are. And each year I have this kind of hard sell. You know, how do you encourage people to come and see bleak films? And as I was saying earlier to the group before we came on, last year actually was our worst year in some ways because things were pretty bleak here. I don't think they've got any better. It's an interesting year. But anyway, things were pretty bleak in terms of conversations around Brexit, the coming elections, and lots of kind of uncertainty. And I think that's why, there were other reasons too, but I think that's why audiences dipped, because it's very hard to muster audience to see stuff. But on the other hand, I often feel like I'm preaching to the converted. The kinds of people who are going to come and see these sort of important films are the kinds of people who are going to come and see these important films. And actually what I want most to achieve is to get people who wouldn't normally see them, or people who might see them but haven't seen that kind of thing, to be drawn in. And because of the film itself, but especially because of the kind of discussion and exchange that happens afterwards, to be properly kind of changed by it. And change, of course, takes so many forms, Being inspired to alter something slightly is a really huge thing. Stopping buying something or stopping going somewhere, or these are really, really big things as well. So we have all kinds of different ways of thinking about, real impact. In terms of the hospice films, that's sort of a whole different category again that I've become because I've done a lot of work and written about death and dying on screen. So I very much wanted to be involved in creating films that were telling stories that were much more honest and true to individuals' experience, because what we see on screen, on television, in Hollywood, etc., are very kind of mythical representations of what it means to be dying of an illness or dying in war or whatever it is. So I have this real sense of the importance of individuals telling their own stories and having the skills to tell it. I don't make films. I hope to enable people to make films. And those films can, of course, be so powerful because of their personal journey, and that's not to be undervalued either. There's a therapeutic benefit to telling your own story, doesn't matter about how the audience is impacted. It's a huge thing. We often think about empowering or giving people skills or whatever as some kind of journey. People with terminal illness aren't going on any journey. The skills that they gain through the project, pretty irrelevant. The value they gain and the kind of therapeutic value and all the kinds of connections and the enriching of their life that goes on, that's kind of invaluable. So, I've said a lot.
I mean, there's so much to talk about. Coming back to your first point about, there were many points when you were talking about the Screening Rights Festival, which happens at the MAC in Birmingham.
It happens at the MAC and will happen here in the future, but for the time being is happening in different venues in Coventry.
And you were just talking a little bit about the environment, the place, because that's a big part of it, presumably. How do you get beyond preaching to the converted or talking to yourselves? Because that presumably is a big part of in terms of the affecting change. That's a significant part of the process. Do you do that with the films? Do you take them out?
We don't take them out at the moment, but we do work incredibly hard to draw audiences in, specifically the audiences that will be most spoken to and most will have the most valuable experience in watching the film and having the discussion, but also those communities that are least likely to probably come to the MAC or to the Warwick Arts Centre. And that involves a lot of work. So that whole idea about creating change or trying to affect change through art involves so much more than the art, and often that's overlooked, the kind of labour that goes on around making things happen. Mm-hmm. And there are hurdles as well. There are reasons why certain communities don't come. I mean, you talked about the Blue Rinse crowd going on in the National Theatre. They've done so much work, as so many institutions have, to try and shift the demographics and their audiences. And we know that kind of emphasis on diversity is part of, every organisation's manifesto. And so often it's about ticking boxes, but it actually involves proper investment and proper understanding and proper critical discussion and involvement of people who know and understand firsthand, and having those conversations and putting all that kind of resources into that happening properly.
And so if one of the ingredients that we're putting into the mix is the kind of the hope and optimism, well, what else would you put in the mix of a work that has the potential to make a change?
I wouldn't say about the film itself. I'll say that I think it's really important to have discussions after films. It's sort of like, as any parent would say, when your kid wants to watch something that's, a bit worrying, you don't know, but is quite important, but you want to have that conversation. Well, we're all kind of naive in relation to certain things, and we all benefit from having a kind of really valuable discussion afterwards. Because after all, I believe change only happens. We only change how we feel, not just about and what we'll do about, say, climate change, but about, say, conflicts, immigration, refugee crime, all of those things. We'll only change them if we're truly able to connect with others. I mean, we've got so much discussion about our responsibility at the moment, which is fantastic. I mean, it's a shame it takes what's going on at the moment to cause us to think properly about social responsibility. But, we should always be thinking about our obligation, our responsibility, and how we connect to others, and art has a capacity.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you, Michelle. Sorry, the art has the capacity to do that. But I think it also has the capacity to patronise and to be slightly didactic, which I imagine, I want to kind of come on to you guys, because I'm sure that these are things that you think about in your context of work. In fact, I might bring them in and then come back to ask you that. Are you able to, who's going first? Amahra? Amber? Oh, okay. So, well, I guess tell us a little bit about MAIA Group and how you that particular idea of talking to your community and trying to affect change in your community without kind of being superior, looking superior, or looking like you're trying to kind of forcibly make a change.
I think we co-founded MAIA Creatives many, many years ago because of our own sort of experiences being artists or being in the industry, and sort of seeing how the differences in especially the cities was quite apparent back then. So in terms of forming an organisation, it wasn't about imposing, it was always about to support and to sustain and to keep going. Like, the arts to us is something that was so important for so many different reasons that, we wanted to encourage that and to keep it going and to make sure that people have a support system, especially where we're from, to know that, you know, we're here, we're championing you, we're pushing you. So that's sort of how it started, and that was, 7 years ago now? Yeah. And it's kind of changed and grown, and
it's changed because, so when Amber's talking about the origins of it, at the time we were young, excited and a bit naive, and kind of thought there are skills and lessons and experiences that we've acquired in our journeys that could we find ways to like share or redistribute or think about what value looks like in a particular context. And so we started to work in a way where we kind of had to stop and check ourselves and be like, are we part of the problem in this way that we're working? For example, we started out with business clubs for artists as one of the things that we did, and that was talking about economics, finance, PR, all of the really like capitalist kind of economic driven things about sustaining a creative practice. And that led to all of the challenges around thinking about capitalism, but then also what is it to talk about business skills in the arts if we don't have the sustained workflow of jobs in a city like Birmingham? What are we assigning those business principles to? And then we had to sort of think about all the additional layers where the artists, most of the artists that we're working with are black or of colour, they're from particular geographies, they're from particular classes, always a funky thing to explore, but from non-privileged economic backgrounds, and which adds different layers. We can't talk about sustainability in the arts if we can't talk about race, geography, class, if we can't have really frank conversations. And I think just to touch on what you said about the diversity initiatives and all those things, is how do we actually talk about those if we're not really prepared to call a thing what it is? If we can't call out racism within our institutions, how do we actually address diversity in what is needed? So then MAIA kind of became this organisation that was like, how do we do active experiments, or how do we reimagine what infrastructure looks like to then see what the active experiments are? And so we've kind of been doing, we've been building a proposal for an artist-led hotel for the last 2 years. I'll talk about that at some point, I'm sure. But also conversations around housing and what does it mean to build community-led initiatives in a time where gentrification, displacement is affecting our communities. How do we use our artistic sensibilities, our artistic capacities to build really pragmatic things? I think that's where it starts to talk about. I think for us, it's about we're investing in things from a particular experience, but it's about collective liberation, ultimately.
Amber, can you give us an example of some of these projects? I mean, maybe it is the hotel, or maybe it's another project, like a kind of tangible, bring MAIA to life, MAIA Group to life for us.
So I'd say in the journey up into the hotel, Utopian World 2 years, but we'll see. We've actually taken on a house as part. It's a new development in a neighbourhood in Birmingham, which we feel is sort of quite close to our heart in terms of what Maura was just speaking about. This house is going to be part of a charitable trust from the developer's point of view, but for us it will be an art house, a community space, an event space, also with the residential aspects of it, which will kind of be, in a way, a stepping stone to what the hotel is likely to be. So obviously I'm sure there'll be challenges along the way, but we now feel that we have a space where we can explore all the things that Maura was just speaking about. We can use it as a tool to bring in the community, to put art out there to audiences that might not ever have seen anything like that before. So yeah, I'd say we haven't started yet. This is a project that's very new.
We've signed a lease this week.
Yeah, very new.
Will artists stay in it? Will the community? I mean, will it be a kind of mix for both?
Yeah, I would say so. I'd say definitely a mix of. We would like to host sort of artist residencies in there, as well as have the public space open for community sort of led things who are not necessarily limited to artists alone. So
and how. It's led by the two of you, and you have a small team. and the audiences, like you, the work that you're doing in Birmingham, because I know you work outside and beyond Birmingham. But are the community? Have they grown with you? Are they friends? Are they people that you've grown up with? I mean, tell us a bit about the audiences that you work with.
Yeah, us too. Yes, in short, it's one of those things of we don't always necessarily frame the things that we do as art as either, which is part of the. If I can go on a slight tangent, we speak a lot about grandparents. We speak a lot about our grandparents and the ways of organising that as migrant communities. A lot of our grandparents in the team came from Jamaica or the Caribbean around the Windrush generation. And we think about all of the collective ways that they organised. So, for example, when they couldn't set up traditional banking arrangements, they had to find their own ways of creating a saving system that was built on trust. So we look at that as a really powerful tool and say, cool, what does that look like for our generation and beyond? What is the thing that we could design or experiment with to think about what that looks like? And then we kind of have this thing of maybe it's not that we don't know about economics, but maybe we don't know the language, or we haven't acquired the language. The journey with the hotel, we kind of developed a project that was about connecting young people with technology and using it to create hip-hop responsive architecture with kids who have never thought about architecture as a field that they would pursue. And we changed the language. You talk about hip-hop being something that is responsive to its environment, that hip-hop is a critique of its environment. So then we say, how could we use hip-hop to reimagine what your city looks like? And suddenly you've got all of these kids who are saying, oh, I have got things to say about the place that I live. Oh, I can build a thing. Oh, it's possible for me. I have the capacity to think about and to reimagine my environment. So sometimes I think it's about changing the language that we use or changing the relationship that we have to that thing. Maybe it's a case of, maybe it is buildings, maybe it's we can't exist in the same sort of buildings or need to find other avenues to do stuff. But then also maybe it's like, maybe people just want to make films. Maybe it's that thing of when you're talking about the value of storytelling and how empowering that is in its own right. Maybe it's people don't want to come into a building to watch a thing, but they would love to make a thing. And I'm interested in that. How do we support people to go on their own liberation journey, whatever that looks like? That might start by going into a building and seeing a thing, but it might start with a change of language as well.
That's beautiful, Amahra. And do you, I'm just interested listening to the way that you talk about your work and your practice, would you, to really kind of extrapolate for that in its simplest terms, would you say that you guys are change agents and art is your medium?
Would you say that, Josephine?
Well, I'm just listening to the way you talk, and that's my read of it, is that in some ways it doesn't really matter. Like, you guys are artists, so that's the stuff that you know, and that's how you're going to try and make an impact.
I think it's come from a place of change because of the issues that we were addressing all those years ago. We thought that there should be a change, like the systems in place weren't for us. There was no sort of support, so it came from a place of change, and it just so happens that we were both in the creative industries at the time, I suppose. So
yeah. Amber said she was a dancer. What's your practice?
Theatre, performance, live art, and I think that even that journey of wanting to reimagine what it means to even be an artist, because sometimes we get into like flusters, being like, can we not just do a thing? Can we not just demonstrate a thing and let people call it whatever they want to call it? Like, so sometimes I'm always in this like constant battle of, when people say, what type of artist are you? And I'm like, the medium doesn't matter. The storytelling or the journey or the process is so much more important than the art form sometimes. And that's kind of, I think, the journey that we're on, is to say, how could we just create a thing that other people might need to assign languages to, but in us not assigning language to, who else then feels like they could explore their own creative capacities because the language hasn't been predetermined or the value hasn't been predetermined.
that's the conversation we always seem to get into, is what is an artist as well, when we're going through these things. Like, you could be an accountant and you made a chair, you're an artist, so it doesn't sort of limit it to... Exactly. Yeah.
And so if we've got optimism and hope, and we've got context, kind of conversation, what other ingredient? What ingredients would you put into the mix?
Investment.
This is vital.
I think as well, like we've been on such a journey about I think trust is such a big thing, like such a powerful tool of when trust is inbuilt into a set of processes, the creative outputs or the anything else it almost becomes part of the work. But on the other side of that is when we're thinking about who isn't invested in or who isn't given access to or all of those things, I think a lot about I don't know if anyone saw the Creative Case for Diversity conference a few years ago, Arts Council's Creative Case for Diversity conference, and Javid Alapour, Manchester, he's not Manchester-based, he's Salford? No, it's Manchester.
He's a theatre director.
Up north, and he talked about this idea of racialized risk, and I thought that was such a poignant term to think about how investment is and isn't made in racial contexts, and just the idea of like who has to jump through what hoops in order to get. I think trust is a really big thing in lots of different variations as another ingredient into the
Trust investment. Before I open up to to you all, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and also any questions and also works that you think have been powerful. I just thought I'd use it as an opportunity to talk about Dash, because I set up Dash with a theatre director to challenge the way we saw the world, to bring artists together, to create new work with international artists. And over the years, we've sort of made work with artists in the former Soviet Union, trying to understand what it was like to live under the Soviet Union and to live today in its shadows. And before that, in the Arabic world, making work with Arabic artists. And we're currently exploring what it means to be European in a kind of post-Brexit landscape. And or what it doesn't mean to be European, depends on, whatever that is, and if it's still something that we can call our own. And I think my process and my approach to it all has been a desire to learn and a desire to listen and a desire to be as open and curious and not impose myself on the conversation all the time. I feel like that's really, I suppose I mentioned it in the context of asking Michele and in you all really about the patronising element. I think the minute you start going in with the mission, with something you want to make people do or understand, it doesn't make for a natural conversation or a natural opportunity to make change. So my ingredient would be an openness and a curiosity and kind of the suppression of the self. And on that note, the suppression of the self, I'm going to ask you all, do you have thoughts and reflections on kind of what the possibility of change? Anyone? Christina has a roving mic. Any questions also? There was a lady here.
I'm currently doing my FMP on activism and protest, and I wondered if you had any advice. I'm an artist, fine artist. It's predominantly based on feminism, but it does obviously come into climate change. It comes into multiculturalism. It covers quite a lot of topics. So I was just wondering if you had any advice.
Can I just clarify? You're going to have to help me with the...
Find a major project for my HND. So it's my second year of my degree.
Thank you. Sophie, do you want to...
How do you have to present it? Are you...
Exhibition.
Amazing. That's exciting.
So it's kind of a big opportunity. I'd like to take the opportunity to get people that are already in the industry to have a viewpoint as well.
Well, I guess that would be my question. Whenever I start a project, I think about who is the audience? Who do I want to be in the audience? Who do I want to collaborate with as audience, but then also as artists or as storytellers? What's the story I'm trying to tell? And so I guess I would offer you the opportunity to think about what is the story you want to tell, and to those people, who are they? To really imagine them, whether they're, Oprah or whatever, just think about who is the ideal audience, and then make that piece for them. And the right people will come, that's in my experience, that would be good.
Michele, do you have any thoughts to add?
Beyond my experience, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to say anything useful.
Yeah, because they're really big subject matters, like huge. In my performance practice 2 years ago, I did a show that was about human trafficking, and the process was, how close to home can we make that thing for one person in the audience? It doesn't matter who it is, because I think it can be really easy to get lost in the huge. I think the most finite way of storytelling that you can get with something really, really particular, because in the particulars becomes the universal. Lots of people can start to find where they fit with that really, really small story. So I think if you can find, and I think that's something that piece has done in the snippet that we saw, is honed in on stories. If you can hone in on a really particular aspect of a story, people find that.
I think that's
broader
absolutely
resonance.
right, and that was when we were making The World We Made. One of the big things was within Jonathan's book. There's so many numbers and figures and so much data to crunch and to get through. And actually, when you boiled it down and you said, who is that one person that has been infected by that, and how can we invest in their journey, you can tell a whole lot of story and a whole lot of world politics by one person going through a journey. You know, I think that's really good.
I wanted to come back, and Michele, to ask you, because we haven't had a chance really to talk about it, but you briefly talked about the hospice films, and you also started to. We were just talking before, and you told me that you've started to take those short films out of Birmingham and into kind of internationally, and coming back to the story and like how the story can touch people. How is it for the audiences in Uganda to hear those films from somewhere, from a completely different world?
Well, despite thinking that I knew everything about the films because I'd seen them so many times and it had been such an intense experience being involved in that project, and then I'd taken them around the UK and Europe to talk about them on so many occasions, and even though they're stories, because of course all the participants, well, most of them are now dead, and so, but there's something very live about them and the continuing relationship with them when you watch films over and over. So yes, I felt like I knew everything about them, and I knew how kind of effective they were, sort of in their universal terms, but I couldn't have realised how universally affecting they would be in Uganda. So I used them in I shared with all kinds of audiences. On one occasion I used them to teach medical students at a medical school, this was in Rwanda actually, in the north of Rwanda, and this was like a very well funded by American money. They'd set up this kind of University of Global Health Equity, and this American money was being pumped in to create this kind of state-of-the-art facility that was going to train local, I can imagine very privileged individuals from certain privileged groups within Rwanda to have the kinds of medical training that's only available in the West. And that in that way they would be so skilled that it would take the health profession in Rwanda to a whole new level. And Rwanda is this kind of model within East Africa of extraordinary kind of developed facilities, etc. There's lots more to say about that. Anyway, in teaching these students, they were so receptive and so moved by the films, and I became so aware, as I did on each occasion that I shared the films in Uganda and Rwanda, of how universal they were, but how there so desperately needed to be films there. And so now I'm very much involved in trying to draw on money that isn't being used by all the usual suspects in trying to do that kind of work, that I might be able to access here to hopefully try and be involved in setting up projects there so that there's all different kinds of films that are going to be made, both community ones, like a community project, much like the one that I did at a hospice here, will be done at a hospice in Uganda with a local filmmaker, a narrative film that will hopefully show on TV that will be about the story of someone with cancer, which has never been shown. There's never been a film about, or any kind of feature-length narrative or story about having a terminal illness. So all kinds of ways that could happen.
That's never across the world, or never made in.
No, it's not across the world. There haven't been narratives. There's such a particular stigma around illness and cancer, and of course HIV. But there's such a different landscape of healthcare out there, and the popular narratives and such a kind of isolation that goes on with people who are ill, and especially in impoverished communities, which is the majority of Uganda who are living in poverty. So there's just this incredible power that can happen, but the films need to be made there. The universal quality was in evidence, and they were films from Birmingham, and Birmingham is in a wonderfully diverse city, so it wasn't about these are sort of rich white Western people at all. It was about a complete slice of Birmingham life, with two of the participants of African heritage as well, which I know helped make the film seem accessible, and that's why I was invited to bring them. So yes, it's extraordinary what film can do, but it really shows up both the universal qualities, but also the desperate need for those kinds of films to sort of happen in all kinds of communities. And it's possible, because technology makes that possible.
Is that helpful? Local, universal, and or knowing your audience. Any more questions? Any more questions about, I think specifically, what works for audiences as well? I mean, I think it's a kind of, the audience aspect is quite an important part of it.
saying that it's
There's a mic.
you were saying that it's getting more difficult, or that you had a really bad year last year or something. And I just thought, just stick with it, because I just feel like I lost my mother to cancer in last August 4th, and have lost other people. And when you go through a death with someone, you just go, that's not the way I thought it was going to be. You know, and I think we think that because we're told so many stories that are wrong about death. And I was talking to the funeral home director, and, you know, we were just talking about how out of touch we are with death, and how it would radically change the world if we became more in touch with the reality of death. So I guess it's just to say, I'd really love to see the films and just keep doing what you're doing. So that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? There's one more.
I had a question for Michele about coming here for the festival. How do you expect that it will change the programming, or the way the festival will be organized? If you will include, I don't know, maybe more of debates or more of something, because you may, I don't know, expect to have more students, or I don't know.
I've been doing it in Coventry as well. We're now in our 6th year, which is miraculous. And I say we, and I actually mean me. For people probably, yeah. So I've been doing it for 2 years in Coventry and Birmingham, and it doesn't. The challenge is always about how much you kind of are embracing. Like I struggle every year with money. You know, I'm constantly writing funding applications to try and pull it off yet again, and to get through it. And every year I say I won't do it again. And anyway, but part of it, Warwick's been very good at saying, you know, speak to the business, you know, and I've met with Warwick Ventures, you know, this could be a possible way of financing it, thinking about a business model. And it's like, this isn't a business, this is about, so it's always a balance between how to be profitable enough to be able to be self-sustaining, how to kind of constantly write funding applications. You know, I'm now looking hopefully to try and find some kind of foundation grant that would at least be more than 1 year, so that it can keep going. Not least because I do it on top of my day job, which I'm currently on strike with, so that I can step away from it and do actually the stuff that I'm probably better at, which is I think, you know, the writing and the thinking. That's why I became an academic. So yes, it's a challenge, but yeah, go on.
But would you, I mean, it's just an idea. It's a very basic idea. But do you think that if students were involved in helping you with the festival, it would help the festival being better known by students, and maybe encourage them to come, even if otherwise they may have been a bit shy about the topics or the kind of films that you're showing?
Students tend, I mean, in the past, I tie certain films to certain student cohorts and subjects, and that is obviously a great way of building a really big audience, and I work very closely with the person who's doing that. I have student volunteers already. I teach a course on film and social change here, and I'm now, for the first year next year, I want to tie the first assessment to the festival so that they will be writing stuff for the festival. So I put in a big application to the alumni fund here with a whole suite of ways in which I wanted to involve local schools as well in making short films. I'd done this before in Birmingham years ago, ran film. I teach sort of smartphone filmmaking for social justice, and I've done that around the world as well. But doing it locally, and they produce films. The best one would be shown in the festival. The others, I'm hoping maybe to do this for City of Culture. The other ones would be screened, you know, in a room next door. There's so many ways. I mean, for me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, the festival just seems like capable of generating so much, but it can't when it's me, who's a full-time academic, doing it alone. So I'm always keen to meet another crazy, enthusiastic person who will take over.
Oh, it's a great advert. Thank you, Michele. I want to ask, I mean, the elephant in the room is, which Michele vaguely referred to, is the coronavirus. You know, you guys have all braved it out this evening. Thank you very much. But I'm very conscious of the need the art's definitely, I mean, there is an extraordinary world of art which is not live and which doesn't require having a communal experience. But to me, as an artist and also as a participant and an audience member, the power often of change is from this kind of collective experience of brainstorming over whether or not, how to help someone change, or being part of a live experience and everyone going through that together. And I'm very aware that, hopefully it will be short term, but we are being encouraged to distance ourselves from each other, and theatres across Europe are closing, venues, kind of collective, collaborative, big spaces are being closed down, and that's a real risk for us as artists. I mean, I was brainstorming with my brilliant colleague Christina, who's very much the we in our organisation. Can we move digitally? What could we do at Dash that would enable us to continue to reach audiences who are having these quite lonely experiences over the next few months? But I'm just interested in really to ask you guys as artists, how do we deal with this current crisis? How can we as artists support people and audiences during this next few months? It's quite a question. Have you thought about it?
Well, my next show is on tentative potential cancellations or postponement. So I'm doing an immersive show in Shoreditch in London in May, end of April. And I got the message from the producer today saying that we're going to go ahead regardless. I guess for me, it's about kindness, actually, to artists, and being kept in the loop by producers is really helpful, because otherwise, if you just get told it's cancelled, there's no pay because it's a force majeure, everyone is screwed. So I'm absolutely about, let's just bring everyone together, and people are sensible. You're all sensible. If you're not feeling well, you wouldn't come. I don't know. I feel like there's got to be a trust, and it's what you were saying earlier. There's got to be a trust between us and the audience to say, let's do this. Speakeasies happened when there was no alcohol allowed. Theatre can happen when mass groupings aren't allowed. I think there's some excitement in that. But yeah, we have to be sensible, of course. And one hopes that it will be a short-lived thing. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I believe in my heart that we go on regardless.
I think there's something about as well the precariousness with which a lot of artists and cultural workers are already working in. I'm saying this as someone who, 2 speaking gigs were cancelled this month, that has a massive financial knock-on effect when you're living end to end. I'm very interested in what is the policy that supports self-employed workers who make up the bulk of the creative and cultural industries.
The budget's just come out and said that there'll be more access to benefits. But and
also, because it's one thing. Yes, they make the provision for that, but also then the loopholes and the jumps and all that you have to go through in order to get that. By which point, you probably burn out all these other things, because it's your everyday. What is it to go through that process when my rent needed to be paid yesterday? And I think it comes back to what everyone's kind of mentioned, this idea of care. I think that's what, and when you talk about kindness, it's can that come from everywhere? Is this not just be an obligation that we as organisations or practitioners have to each other, but that the state should have to all of us as well, who exist in a vulnerable capacity in any way?
Yes, here. And a responsibility. Do we have a responsibility alongside that to try and kind of to combat this? Sorry, Michelle, you were going to say something totally different, and I've asked you. Please feel free to respond to my first question rather than responding to the second one. But I was wondering about, it's quite hard, I think, for us all to look beyond our personal situation, and then then we have this sort of sense of, do we have a responsibility to do we still yet have to find a responsibility to help to combat the bigger issues, the wider issues? I suppose this isolation is really to me, it's quite a looming concern. But you don't need to answer that question.
I was going to ask, yes, would be my answer. And then I actually, unusually, rather than talk about ethics or responsibility, I did want to sort of pick up on that challenge, because, care, and intimacy are the currency of change, of human connection and change. Now, how can we do... Put it on a T-shirt. Put it on a T-shirt? But how can one create intimacy during periods of social isolation and distancing? Now, obviously, I work on film, and film is can be live cinema, not forgetting about that, but mostly it is all about, and I believe strongly in, the extraordinary power of the intimacy created on screen between that kind of dynamic between the screen and the spectator. But it is a challenge in any art field, and I'm sure with technology, with the brilliance of the human capacity for innovation and art, this is the new challenge. This is possible. I think it's it.
And I mean, you're already sparking in my mind how I could absolutely create a performance that means that you're always a metre away from everybody else, and that you have to go on an individual journey, but that would employ thousands of artists, but you get an individual experience, and by the end of it, you've seen something incredible. I'm sure we could do that. Yeah. So there'll be obviously lots of money sloshing around from someone, because loads of shows have been cancelled. So we'll keep thinking about that. But there's got to be a will and a way, I guess. That's the thing. And I suppose what's so brilliant about everyone coming out tonight, and hopefully to my show in April, that there will be this sense that people will want to continue to be entertained and talk to and communicate, and we just have to find a way of doing that, don't we?
We sure do. And I hope, and thank you for sharing those ideas, and I'm looking forward to seeing that next show. Not the show in April, but the next show about on phones at distances with everyone like trying the Wuhan shake from afar. I'm going to ask the wonderful Irina to play us out this evening. She's going to play for us shortly, but I'm going to do a couple of thank yous before she plays. I want to do an enormous thank you to Sophie and to you all for bringing to life the world we made. Thank you so much to you all. Thank you to Sophie, to Amahra and to Amber from MAIA Group. Please check out their project and possibly come and see their house. Look, it's Abuela.
Abuelo is the hotel, Yard is the house.
Abuela and Yard. And to Michele with her Screening Rights Festival, possibly here later in the year.
It'll be in Coventry, certainly, probably at, I don't know, Square One or Fargo, don't know, but at the Mac in Birmingham. But the films, the hospice films are available. Clips of them are available online, but if you wanted to watch them in full, you could always email me. They're available. The clips are available on Life Moving. The project's called Life Moving. lifemoving.org is where you can get them.
Oh, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. So I hope you enjoyed our discussion. A huge thanks again to all my guests that evening for their contributions, to Warwick Arts Centre for commissioning and hosting the live event, and a special thanks to you all for listening. I hope you may feel a little bit inspired by my brilliant guests in the conversation. We recorded this episode just days before we all moved indoors. It felt quite poignant to me to listen back to such an animated live conversation, and especially hearing Michele's reflection that care and intimacy are the currency of change. I believe that the challenge for us all is to find ways to sustain that care and intimacy during these times of distance. The team behind the Dash Arts podcast is me, Josephine Burton, Christina Catalina and Natalie Beach. Our intro music is from Dancing Fakir by Maruf Majidi. Our theme song is called On the Edge of Your Spring, written by Sasha Elukovic with music arranged by Andy Hall. You can find more episodes wherever you get your podcast, or by going to our media section on our website, dasharts.org.uk. If you like the Dash Arts podcast, follow the show, share, and please leave us a review. It helps us stay visible and would mean the world to us. I'm Josephine Burton, back in a fortnight with more conversations at the Dash Arts podcast. Thank you for listening.